Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and a very warm welcome to this Governors for Schools webinar. The focus of this morning's webinar is experiences of Ofsted during the autumn term of 2021, or so far as we've got through the term at this stage. Sorry, I think I muted myself inadvertently then. We have a very large number of governors joining us this morning. So as ever, we would welcome questions and comments, and please ask you to use the Q&A panel to do that. We will do our level best to be able to answer them, but what we'll probably do is end up grouping those questions together. But please do keep those questions coming, because we do value your participation in the session. My name is Steve Barker, and I'm joined by my colleague Linda Waghorn this morning, and I'm going to hand over to in just a moment. We're here facilitating this webinar on behalf of Governors for Schools this morning from Better Governor. Better Governor, as I'm sure many of you will know, is an online platform for providing guidance, support and advice to governors, and as ever we're delighted to be facilitating this session this morning. So with no more ado, I'm going to hand over to Linda to take you through the first part of the presentation.
Thank you, Steve, and good morning, everybody. As Steve has said, the subject of our webinar this morning is considering Ofsted, particularly in the light of autumn 2021. So we're going to think about how the return to full inspection, visiting schools by inspection teams, has reflected or been nuanced to reflect the impact of the pandemic on a wide variety of schools, but through that lens of the Ofsted Framework 2019. What does that look like when it is transferred through that lens of the coming out of the pandemic and the impact that that pandemic has had on the children in that school? We're going to consider then how that has actually been put into practice this term, what has happened so far, what information has been shared so that we have a common understanding of how inspection teams are working and how they're doing that particular piece of work. And then we're going to focus on, so what does it mean for governors? What are the questions that governors are being asked? How are they taking part in the inspection process, and what are the final reports that are published by Ofsted including? So that's the way in which we've shaped the session for you this morning. And as usual with these sessions, if you've joined us before, we start with the top level information, and then we start to look at how that pans down into these different tiers of
Sorry to cut across you, Linda, but just before we get into that, we've got a number of people asking, are we going to share the slides? I believe that Governors for Schools have already shared them. If they haven't got to you yet, they will be, but they're certainly on their way. They're being shared with everybody who's attending today.
Yes, I certainly saw that message in the chat before the session started, that that they were being shared. So hopefully everybody will have those at some point. So as usual, we start with the guidance. We start with that top level information. Ofsted are very good at publishing not only all of their booklets and pieces of information, handbooks, framework, instructions to inspectors. They also publish a series of blogs and information so that they share the latest questions and information in a very thorough way. So if you want to, if this is your first foray into understanding Ofsted, and autumn term always means that we have some new governors, the information on Ofsted website is well worth having a look around. There are two types of inspections. Both have handbooks associated with them. One is called a Section 5 inspection and the other is called a Section 8 inspection. A Section 5 inspection is the inspection where everything is looked at and a grade is given in each of the areas. We'll talk about that earlier, and a report is published showing the inspection team's findings in each of those areas. That's what we generally talk about. Most people's understanding is formed through that framework of a full inspection. There are also Section 8 inspections for good and outstanding schools, where the previous inspection judgment is visited but judgments are not changed. So looking at that information anew, often they were shorter inspections in the past, but this Section 8 inspection does not change the initial judgment made under a Section 5 inspection unless there is something significant to trigger a further look, and in which case that inspection is changed to a Section 5 inspection. So two types of inspections. We are focusing most of our information for the rest of the session about Section 5 inspections. That's that thorough look. What does a thorough look at the school in each of these areas look like? What kind of questions and lines of inquiry are followed in order to publish a new report, making judgments in each of those areas and judgments overall about a school? I don't know if there was anything you wanted to add to that, Steve.
No, I think the only thing I would say is that we've given you the URLs or the links for both of these websites on our penultimate slide this morning, as we always do. They are only available in HTML documents, so they're not available as a downloadable document anymore, which personally I find a little bit frustrating, but you can actually have a look at these. We're not recommending them as bedtime reading, but as a reference aid just to dip in and out of there can be actually very useful.
And again, these are the handbooks that inspectors use in order to carry out these judgments. So it's important that we understand what that looks like. And Steve and I would argue on some occasions, remind inspectors that this is what they are supposed to be doing. We're not expecting that as governors new to this topic, you would be in that position, but it is important that you understand the basics and understand how an inspection would be carried out, and hopefully the rest of the slides that we're sharing with you will give you that first level understanding, which will make some of this a little bit more digestible if you wish to do some further research. So let's look first of all at the timing of inspections, because clearly inspection teams have not been going into schools during the pandemic. And so schools that were last inspected before the pandemic, so there is a shape, all schools are now in the framework, in the inspection regime. And normally what schools would do is to anticipate when an inspection is likely to take place. And what has happened because of the pandemic is that a delay has occurred. That means schools can be up to 6 terms behind that anticipated inspection date. New schools, including those schools that have converted to academies or have opened as new schools, they will get their first inspection within 3 years of opening or converting. So that's the position I'm in as a chair of governors. Our school joined a trust in September 2020, and therefore our first routine inspection will be within that first 3 years, or towards the end of that 3-year period. Importantly, the 2019 framework, and I absolutely understand here that we are only looking at a short period of time between September 2019 and March 2020, when we started to suffer the first lockdown and impact of the pandemic. That is only a short window where that new framework was fully in place and inspections were taking place under it. This brought into play the fact that schools that were previously judged outstanding were exempt prior to that framework being introduced. And the new framework brought outstanding schools into that regular pattern of inspection, so being inspected within a legal 5-year period. And for many outstanding schools, the last formal inspection that they had was some years ago, in some cases 12, 13 years ago. And so all schools now are brought into this regular pattern of inspections. And it should be possible for certainly your head teachers, your principals, will have some idea of when they might next expect an inspection to take place, but there is no definite this term will be the term that your school will be inspected. Now, overarching this, Steve and I would very much say that we do not, as schools and as governors, prepare in any particular way to be inspected by Ofsted. The things that we do in schools in terms of delivering education under the Education Act and under the guidance that the DfE issues are the things that we expect our schools to doing. And as governors, we behave, we do the things that we expect legally and regulatory we should be doing. This inspection, when it occurs, looks through a particular lens, is shaped in a particular way, but it is just a way of checking that what we are doing are the things that are expected of us, and that we are delivering a good level of a standard of education for pupils in our schools and academies. Therefore, we don't do anything particularly different to prepare for an inspection. We just do the things that we should be doing well, and therefore we should be, when inspected, found to be doing those to the correct standards and at the correct level. So let's have a look a little bit more. I think we've jumped a slide there, Steve. Thank you. Look at the nuancing of the pandemic. What has happened that is any different to our expectations in autumn 2019? So new framework, it is the same framework. It is the 2019 framework introduced after a wide period of research, and it has been nuanced to reflect the impact that COVID has had on the lives of the pupils, the education of our pupils in our schools and academies. So these are the main areas, therefore, that we would be looking at, and as governors, you will recognise these areas, because these are the things, certainly if you've joined us before on previous webinars, you will know that we've talked about each of these areas in depth as potential areas for focus for governors, in order to ensure that we are providing the right level of holding to account for our schools. So there will be, for some pupils, COVID generated gaps, interruptions to their learning. Some children have had more of an impact on their learning than others, particularly those children from disadvantaged backgrounds. But what Ofsted will be looking at is, how has the school and how have governors strategically ensured that there is a proper programme of activities and support around the recovery, the support for pupils from those gaps in their learning. So what does the school found out and analysed, and how have the plans that the school has introduced been designed to help pupils recover well from any gaps in their learning? What has been the impact of separate piece of research done by Ofsted, separate understanding around safeguarding, but peer-on-peer abuse and violence within our educational settings? You may recall we did, there is some discussion about the Everyone's Invited website. There was a piece of Ofsted research, a rapid review looking at evidence, but the assumption here is that even without detailed reports in your school, there should be an expectation that there is peer-on-peer abuse happening in school, or the potential for that to happen. It could be unreported. Therefore, what are the school's plans and what is the curriculum delivery to reduce and support pupils who may have been suffering, or maybe policy and procedures to ensure that they do not suffer, or that these areas are quickly reported and quickly dealt with.
Linda, sorry, just to jump in there, I've got a question that's come in from Hannah regarding the first bullet point. And Hannah's asking, how much will we as governors be asked about what happened during COVID and how the school ensured that children continued with their learning? I think it's a little bit of a sort of piece of string one in a way, Hannah. Anecdotally, we've spoken to probably a dozen or so schools that have been inspected already. And Linda and I both belong to a national network of people doing similar roles to ourselves who've talked to lots of other schools that have been inspected. There is absolutely a reference. They talk to school leaders to quite a large extent about not so much what actually happened during COVID, but it's always the so what question. So if gaps arose, if children missed a lot of their learning, if there are perhaps deficits in progress that weren't there previously, what's the school doing about it now? What's the school been doing since September, and what does it plan to do, including, of course, how those additional grants that are available to schools, how they've been used to construct the school's response to the pandemic, or more precisely, the impact of the pandemic.
And although inspectors were very clear in this 2019 framework that they do not expect to, nor will they be encouraged to look at assessment information, they will need, and as governors we need to know that children have been assessed in their learning to understand what those gaps were, and therefore that the plan that resulted from that is appropriate and nuanced to meet different groups of children's needs. And this hopefully is something that you'll recognise as governors from your virtual meetings about how the school reacted, what they did with their remote learning offer, how they supported children from different vulnerable groups in school. There is probably a body of evidence available to all governors, even if you're new, looking back at the minutes of previous meetings during that period of time, to say, well, what did the school do about this? What did they tell us they were doing about it? How were the plans then formulated on what they understood from the assessment of pupils that they had done? Arguably, we're looking at now spring data from this year and end of summer data for this year. Is it working? And how has that been changed or refined and reviewed in order to meet the needs as children went into the new academic year in September 2021? So pick up these last 3 bullet points here. There is a requirement to be teaching the new relationship, sex and health education curriculum, introduced at the beginning of the pandemic, an expectation, but should be fully in place now by the beginning of summer 2021. So again, has that been fully implemented? As governors, we should know that we held the school to account for that. Is it picking up some of these other aspects, particularly thinking about things like well-being and socialisation, that offer that would include an approach that is correct for meeting those relationship aspects, particularly around sexual abuse and violence? Is that policy and process into practice? Thinking about the curriculum, and arguably the 2019 framework was designed to focus specifically on the curriculum, what is taught. That includes not only what we would see in what we might think of as classroom lessons, but also the extracurricular activities and visits and offer that is available for all children. So what has been done around our curriculum in our school or academy that is reflective of the impact of COVID and has responded to that analysis of what the impact has been on our pupils, and how that is still meeting the requirements to deliver that broad and balanced curriculum, but has flexed in order to reflect that understanding of where our pupils are and what their needs might be. And then finally, thinking about the significant amount of our time excuse me, that has been spent online. If we think of our own experience as adults during the pandemic, the amount of time online, both in terms of learning for our pupils, but also online activity in other areas, thinking about what online safety has looked like in our school, the systems and processes and policies that have been introduced, the understanding of what has happened to our pupils online, and ensuring that they remain safe. Most of us are continuing with some form of online activities. I'm in a chair of a primary school in a MAT. Our homework is still being delivered through our online remote learning platform, reflecting that readiness if we needed to use that at any point in the next academic year. But thinking about the relationship here to safeguarding and the increase in grooming and in all kinds of ways, both sexual and around exploitation and radicalisation. So it's about thinking, what is it the school has done during the pandemic to understand what the impact has been on our pupils, and therefore how and where is this reflected in the plans that are currently in place at the time of the inspection? Are they appropriate given what the school has learned and is continuing to learn about its pupils?
And I think it's also worth mentioning there, Linda, that of course Ofsted always will talk to pupils in our schools. They'll talk to children, they'll talk to young people as a way of triangulating what they've heard from school leaders, from teachers, other staff, and obviously sometimes from us as governors as well.
And certainly that's been my experience as a chair, is that the views of pupils are very much at the forefront of understanding, for example, the remote learning offer, some of the changes the school made to how they were delivering reflected what pupils said. They said they would like to hear their teacher's voice, and there was some feedback organised, built into the system that was in place to reflect that. So I think it's important that we understand how that voice, pupil voice, has been gathered and informs those plans. So let's look at the framework itself, and I recognise that some of you might be a little new to this whole subject. So this was originally a slide that Ofsted shared when they were introducing the 2019 framework, and it does represent the 4 judgments that are made individually, and then an overarching judgment made as a result of these 4 individual judgments. The quality of education judgment, which includes both the way in which the intention of the curriculum, so the way in which the curriculum has been designed to meet the needs of all pupils, the implementation of that designed curriculum, and the impact it has had. So those 3 I's, as we call them, intent, implementation, and impact. Those are things that you'll probably have heard talked about in your meetings as if you've talked about pupils' learnings. This is approximately 40% of the overall judgment made of the school, and it includes what the curriculum covers in its broadest sense, including, as I said, those visits and extracurricular activities. And it will now include, if we're looking through that COVID frame, that lens, we're looking at the use of any additional grants that have been made to the school in order to support pupils' learning. So the Catchup recovery funding and the national tutoring funding. So what is it that has, in your understanding as governors, that has been introduced there? How has it been used? So how is it intended to use? How is it implemented? And what has been the impact? Or what is the intention for that impact, and how are you measuring it? There are some links here, as you would absolutely expect, to areas that are not necessarily curriculum, part of the quality of education, but are included in the curriculum, the way in which we shape and offer support and curriculum activities around the behaviour and attitudes, standards for behaviour, very much part of the governor's overview, and attendance, that all children were very keen to come back to school. What does that look like now? How has that changed over time? What has the school done to support, encourage, and ensure that pupils are attending? Because if they are not attending school, then that recovery, that catch up cannot be fully implemented. So supporting, understanding what your school is doing to support attendance is vitally important. Within personal development, we have that response to the implementation of relationship, sex and health education, and it includes that whole area of pupil well-being and the social impact for pupils and the way in which maybe additional support has been put in place, but particularly around the full implementation of that new curriculum. And then thinking about leadership and management and governance is part of that leadership and management judgment. So the effectiveness of leadership overall, we would be looking here at how the leadership, including governance, has responded to this period of disruption with COVID, how the curriculum has been reviewed and is being implemented, and then looking at staff workload. This was very much an aspect of the 2019 framework. We will all be aware how much impact there has been on teacher workload during the pandemic period, but it is important that we understand what is being done and how our school has responded to trying to reduce workload. That may be something that we're looking at in a little bit more detail now as things become slightly more normalised. But in going through this recovery period, how are we responding? Now we have all pupils back in school. If we are lucky enough to be in a low infection rate and attendance at school is high, and most of our staff are able to fully engage with, what does that look like now? And are the plans that our school or academy had fully in place and designed to meet all of these aspects in full? So we would expect any organisation to keep its workforce fully informed and up to date, and indeed the inspection team themselves are no different, and there are updates that are provided on a regular basis to support inspectors' work. And as I said at the top of this session, they are shared publicly so that we can see as schools, as governors, what it is that has been shared with inspectors, and we can see through that same lens that there is some work that is being done, and we can fully understand what that looks like. So if we think about what the latest information might have been to inspectors this term, what we will find if we look at the Ofsted update that was issued on the 9th of September, we will see that there have been changes to the guidance and inspection instruments that are shared, 20 updates since that date that are impacting on the way in which the inspection team carry out their work. And you would expect, wouldn't you, because a team are now back into school, that some reflection about what they're actually finding in those early reports, as well as reflecting all of that new guidance and the nuances of those the changes that have happened, that they will review and reflect and update those practices. There's some increased clarity over Section 5 and Section 8 inspection, and there have been significant updates to the curriculum and the implications, therefore, on how inspectors carry out that that activity when they are visiting our schools. And at this point, I'm going to hand over to Steve, and he is going to take you through the remaining slides, and we'll just drill down a little bit more into, so what does that look like and what are the implications for us as governors? Over to you, Steve.
Lovely, thanks, Linda. And just before we press on, a very good point being made by Sue here. Sue's saying that many schools are still dealing with ongoing COVID-related absence from staff as well as pupils. Absolutely, Sue. And I think what we will find is that there's huge variation across the country. I happen to live in the northwest of Surrey, and certainly with the secondary school that I'm chair of, and the trust as well, have now stepped up their measures in response to a very large number of incidents of positive testing. The infection rate overall is actually double the national average where I live at the moment. Ofsted, it has to be said, the information they're giving to inspectors right now in this very document that Linda's just been talking about says they have to be mindful of the local context from a health and safety point of view. That's about protecting inspectors, but of course it's also about protecting staff and children. I think there is a debate to be had if the school is, an individual school has a very large number of staff not there and a large infection rate. It doesn't actually spell it out, but it does imply that there is a potential conversation to be had about deferral. But Ofsted, generally speaking, are not in favour of deferral. It may just mean that a lot of the inspection would be done perhaps through virtual meetings, although the team would still expect to be in school. But I don't think that's been fully tested yet, Sue, but I think certainly it's a very good point to make, and I think it's something that we do need to be mindful of. Okay, well, let's press on. So the document that Linda's just been talking about does go into quite a lot of detail on those 20 areas which Ofsted think are worthy of giving inspectors either additional information or reiterating some of the previous messages. And they cover a lot of the things that we've already talked about, but as Linda said, they go into a little bit more detail. And what I've done on this next slide is just pulled out specifically relating to curriculum catch-up. Ofsted have put this section in that's called, after every one of these different headings, implications for inspectors. So this particular slide here has been lifted directly from that Ofsted update, as it's called, and it's an update for inspectors. It's in the public domain, so everybody in schools can see it as well. But this tells inspectors what Ofsted expect of them when conducting inspections right now. So we're thinking specifically about curriculum catch-up and any of those gaps that, as Linda says, may have arisen during the pandemic thus far, through those partial school closures, etc. So Ofsted are saying that inspectors should consider, and again, this is about leadership, but it's also about the quality of education / curriculum judgment as well, whether leaders take actions that are appropriate for subject and phase. So phase just means whether it's primary, secondary, key stage 1, key stage 4, etc. But for each subject, and of course what we will be aware of as governors, hopefully, is that some decisions have been taken in schools because of perhaps some of those gaps that have arisen, to maybe restrict the curriculum in some subjects. Ofsted are very much coming at this now from a perspective of, okay, we want to understand what schools did at the height of the pandemic, what they've done since then to actually look at trying to close some of those gaps or accelerate the rate of progress that certain groups of pupils are making. But we want to look at that, or the expectation is that Ofsted will look at that from the expectation that there is a trajectory of returning to more of a sense of normality. So breadth and balance in the curriculum is always important, and what Ofsted want to see, and that's what the word appropriate is all about, is okay, we may have flexed our ability in a school to change the curriculum during the pandemic, but are we on a road back to a more normal, balanced, full breadth of the curriculum offering as we go forward? I can see that Julie's put a question on here about the national tutoring programme. That, of course, is one of the potential actions that schools can take. I think anecdotally, it's fair to say that it's actually been a little bit of a curate's egg, this one. There has been some large variation nationally in terms of schools being able to access tutors, certainly to be able to get access to them in the time frame that they're looking for. And of course, it is, according to a lot of school leaders, quite a bureaucratic process in terms of being able to demonstrate that you're eligible to actually claim the funding there. So I think the tutoring programme is something that we need to perhaps explore at local level. So certainly as governors, we should be aware, is it being used, but more importantly, from a governance perspective, is it effective? Is it actually making a difference? Amanda Spielman, who's the Her Majesty's Chief Inspector, the operational leader of Ofsted, she has gone on record several times as saying that she believes, and there is evidence from the Education Endowment Foundation as well, that children learn best, recover best from gaps in learning, being taught by the teachers they know in a classroom setting. So one of the things that specifically inspectors are looking at the moment relates specifically to where youngsters are actually being taken out, and it goes back to that bottom bullet point here, where youngsters are being perhaps taken out for tutoring during the school day. Is that actually restricting their access to the rest of the curriculum? And that's what Ofsted are actually getting at by using that term negative consequences. So it may well be you're being taken out for extra English tuition, but does that mean that you're having no geography at all, or no limited access to the maths curriculum as a consequence? So those are some good things to frame questions for us as governors, I would say. And of course, all of this comes out of assessment, and you'll be very aware that what I've put here on this second bullet point, Ofsted are looking at the use of assessment. They're not interested in looking at assessment per se. They are explicitly told not to look at schools' own internal assessment, but that doesn't mean they don't expect it will take place. It must take place because it informs what's taught, of course. So what Ofsted are looking at is basically the so what question. Many of you may have seen I answered a question in the panel a little bit earlier. The so what question is always, okay, if that's what assessment tells you about where children and young people are in their learning in your school, what have you done about it? What are you doing about it now in November 2021? Identification of knowledge that's most significant when choosing what to insert into an adjusted curriculum comes back to this idea that, okay, if we know that we've got gaps in children's learning, let's actually take perhaps a Key Stage 1 example, where we know that children would have had a full year and a half, perhaps, so far of learning phonics. But there are many gaps, so perhaps schools will be spending more time in year 2 on phonics than historically would have been the case, because that part of the curriculum would have been covered in reception in year 1. That's perfectly acceptable. There's a very logical reason for doing that, but schools have to be able to, certainly play that narrative, that explanation to Ofsted inspectors. And again, you'll see, I don't need to talk to each one of these bullet points here, but you will see each of these bullet points really is suggesting a very tight focus from Ofsted that is really unpicking what's been done to the curriculum. The curriculum is the backbone of this inspection framework, as Linda said earlier, and therefore this is still going to form a very large part of the inspection. COVID has interrupted it, there's no doubt about that, but what we are seeing from inspections this term is that there's not a sort of line in the sand being drawn, but there is very much a, okay, COVID happened and is still happening to an extent in our schools right now. What did we do about it then? But most importantly, what are we doing about it now? And what difference is this making at this point in time to hopefully the accelerated progress that those groups of children that perhaps were disadvantaged during the pandemic are actually making in their learning?
Jim has made an interesting point about the experience in his school, talking about something called sticky learning, and that was a key issue or focus in the 2 inspections that have taken place in the MAT, which he's involved with, and they wanted evidence of specific learning, in particular in the wider curriculum, in planning documents for all subjects and all phases. So it seems there that the inspection team was trying to understand how the school had created that pathway and what they've used in terms of evidence. So following that thread, if you like, of this is what the schools discovered, this sort of subject of sticky learning, what had been done and how it had been done in terms of that application or implementation across that wider school. So it's back to that, what's the intent, what's it meant to do, how has it been implemented? And it seems here that the inspectors were focusing on that implementation across the school. Was it consistent? And looking at then that early impact. So it is that same thread, but it will be different in each school. So thanks for that example, Jim.
Absolutely, and again, I think that's entirely consistent, Jim, with what we've seen in other schools and other trusts in terms of their inspections. This is very much about the curriculum and how ultimately it's about response, as Linda's saying. Quick question from Andy there. Andy's saying, are the 2020-2021 updates now included in the October release of the handbook? To an extent they are. I mean, don't forget that the handbook is part of the kit that inspectors have, so that is absolutely up to date with all of the changes. It will not contain some of the information that, for example, I'm showing you on this slide at the moment. That's why the update is there to update those guidance. But again, I've actually given you the URL at the end of the presentation so that you can actually look at the update, and anybody can register with Ofsted, governors, school leaders, anybody else who's interested to get an alert when the updates are, they're not produced on a every month basis or every 6 weeks, but they're produced when necessary. So this was actually produced to support inspection in the autumn term of 2021, which is why we're sharing it with you, but it is absolutely available, Andy. Okay, let's move on at that stage. This obviously, I mean, we've had quite a few questions on this already, which is perfect because that's the thought-provoking element of it that we wanted to actually bring to you this morning. But we do need to think about what this means for our own questioning as governors of our schools and of our leadership teams, in terms of if these are the sorts of trails that Ofsted are going down when they're looking at the curriculum, specifically the impact that COVID's had on it. Are we prepared for that? What have we done? Is there a shared story that everybody is actually going to be able to relay to Ofsted on that? And some of those questions that we might want to ask, of course, does first and foremost, I think for us, assessment is the key here. We've talked a lot about the impact of the pandemic being the emergence of gaps, or perhaps the widening of gaps that were already there. It is only through rigorous assessment that schools will know that. It's not for us as governors to be experts on assessment, but it is for us to know that we've got rigorous and robust assessment processes in place that do inform teachers on what those gaps are, and therefore what they have to teach in order to aim to actually close those gaps. So a really good question I would suggest there. Have we flexed the curriculum at all? And if so, where have we done that? How have we done it? And I think, given what I've just said to you on that previous slide, and what's our plan for return to normal? Because that's certainly, we know anecdotally, is something that's being questioned quite a lot by Ofsted inspectors at the moment. Jim's point about the the sticky subjects, I think was the terminology used. That's, I think, where there is this idea that we're thinking about some of those gaps, and do those gaps actually exist because elements of the curriculum were missed, or probably more likely children, young people have maybe forgotten, some of them haven't had the opportunity to apply their learning. Therefore, there may be calls for elements of the curriculum to be repeated. And that's where I think where that sticky terminology actually comes from. We've talked about the tutoring programme already. Key question for us as governors there is, if our schools are engaging with the national tutoring programme, what difference is it making? So it's the so what question again, really. And the next couple of slides do relate specifically to inspections that have actually taken place this term already. I'm not going to tell you the names of the schools, although they're in the public domain. You could research in the same way I did to actually put these particular slides together. But every single one of these boxes here is a quote lifted directly from a single inspection here. I'm not going to read them out to you. I'll just give you a moment or two just to scan over them, and you can see the sort of comments that are actually being made. And I'm sure it comes as no surprise. I'm not going to turn this into a guessing game, but if I were to ask you what judgment you think this school got overall, I'm guessing that most of you would realise that this is a school that was judged to be outstanding. Now, I think some of the things that are worth pointing out here is the superlatives that are used in some of these statements. If you, hopefully you can see my cursor moving over the screen here, but this pink one near the top right-hand corner, leaders have developed an inspirational and innovative curriculum. Across the school, pupils behave exceptionally well. The school is exceptionally inclusive and caring. I think this gives you an indication of the sort of characteristics that Ofsted are looking for when they're going to award that outstanding judgment. We've had a couple of comments on the panel already about outstanding schools. Certainly in Surrey, the educational authority that I live in, we have had a number of schools that were sitting on outstanding judgments being pushed right to the head of the queue in the early part of this term. I think we're up to about 15 or 16 inspections already, and I think a good 7 or 8 of those have been schools, as Linda said, some of them not been inspected for more than 10 years, some up to sort of 13, getting on for 14 years. They've actually been at the forefront of this. Now, in order for those schools to actually hold on to that outstanding judgment, or in order for schools to be upgraded or given an outstanding judgment, these are the sort of things that Ofsted need to be able to see in evidence. And I think this is actually quite helpful for us as governors, because, again, this is all about how we frame our question. So if you just think about that curriculum one, pink box up in the top left quadrant of the screen, leaders have developed an inspirational and innovative curriculum. As a governor, I'd want to be going back to my schools now if I just found this and saying, well, you know, what do we need to do? What needs to be done to a curriculum to have Ofsted recognise it and describe it as inspirational and innovative? Now, that's not a quick answer. I'm not going to propose to actually expand on that, but I think all of these things do mean that as governors, we have to have an understanding. There's no resting on laurels as governors. We shouldn't assume because we were outstanding last time and that standards have actually held up reasonably well in the last 10 years or so, that we will hold on to those judgments, because actually curriculum is king or queen, depending on which way you want to view this, under the current framework. And we need to ensure that actually, if we think we're going to be outstanding, we need a curriculum that Ofsted would use, not necessarily inspirational and innovative, but actually words from a superlative perspective that are up there with those. Now, in the same vein, I've pulled together a second set of comments from a different inspection here with a different outcome. And I will just wait a moment or two so you can actually just scan down these, because I would just like you to think about, well, what would you expect this school to actually be judged as? If this was your school, you'd want your pupils to be proud to be attending. You'd want most of them to be behaving well, both in and out of lessons. Pupils with SEND are well supported, and so on. This school, as it happens, was judged to be requiring improvement. And there are some clues there, and of course the biggest clue, and the reason I've put it in the bright pink right in the middle of the page there, the amount of time pupils spend studying different subjects also needs further consideration. That's something specifically relating to the curriculum. There's an element here about breadth and balance, which is one of those themes I mentioned earlier. But clearly in this school, Ofsted did not think that the quality of education, because of the curriculum, was as strong as it could be. And again, somebody mentioned deep dives on the question panel earlier. The bottom grey box, the big one there in the darker colour, subject leaders have started to consider ways to pupils learn and remember important topics. sorry, I don't know why I've put 2 full stops there. Subject leaders only started. So there's not a finished or a complete journey here. And that's the other clue. So as governors, I think the questions that we need to think about is, what is the state of our curriculum at the moment? When did we last audit the curriculum as a school? I don't mean as a governing body, but when was the curriculum last audited? How do we think that as school leaders, that stands up to scrutiny from Ofsted at this point in time? And subject leaders, or in secondary schools, probably more likely to be called heads of department, how strong are they in leading their subjects? How much knowledge have they got that enables them to, from their subject-specific perspective, to support the curriculum across the whole school? Okay, a few other considerations very quickly in the last few moments of the few minutes of the webinar. Linda mentioned attendance a little bit earlier, and Sue, in her question, sorry Sue, I'm not very good at names, I'm afraid, was asking specifically about attendance and its impact. It does continue to be impacted, of course, at the moment, but schools are still expected to, as Linda said, be providing remote education for those who are able to access it. In other words, if they're not actually ill, we've got a number of children actually isolating in schools at the moment. As governors, do we know that schools are providing that remote access to learning for children? Attendance is part of that behaviour and attitudes judgment, as Linda mentioned, so don't forget that. Be aware of what attendance levels are. The DfE are issuing weekly attendance updates at the moment, and they're publishing termly data at the end of each term. So know where your school sits. Not necessarily anything you can do about it if children are ill, of course, but what we ought to be doing is making sure that we have certainly an awareness of how COVID, if it's impacting, is impacting on attendance. But of course, as ever, the so what question, so what are we doing about it? Teacher workload, again, as Linda said, actually does remain a consideration. I think clearly there's a political agenda here. It's something that the main head teacher associations and teacher unions have been beating the department up for on a number of occasions over recent years. It's been picked up by the DfE. It's also being monitored by Ofsted. There is no magic wand solution to this. There really isn't. But it is worth thinking about as governors, if you haven't already in your boards. Have we got some examples of the sort of things that we've done as a school? Not that we've necessarily done as governors, but certainly things that we've supported that do help reduce workload. I can give you one example, the trust where I'm chair. One of the things that happens now, and again, it was widely consulted on, I realise it's not universally popular with everybody, but at our trust, email is turned off at 6 o'clock on a Friday evening, and it does not come back on again until 6 o'clock on a Sunday evening. Now, that has actually gone down exceptionally well and has actually contributed to workload issues over the weekend. Now, I happen to be married to a teacher. My wife would actually hate that because she does a lot of work over the weekend because she chooses to. So it's not about a panacea, it really isn't, but it's about tangible examples. And if as governors, we can actually discuss those so that perhaps we've got one up our sleeve that we can actually drop into a conversation with an inspector, I would say that's actually a sensible route to go. Linda's mentioned peer-on-peer sexual abuse and violence a couple of times. I just wanted to reiterate that point here and just to say to you, in the detailed guidance that's been given to inspectors through that update, it does actually explicitly point out that all inspectors have received specific training on the implications of the Ofsted review earlier this year and the new revised DfE guidance. So they are genned up on this. There's no doubt about that whatsoever. And one of the things that they're asked to actually do when they go into schools, or I say asked, told to do, because it says inspectors will review records about safekeeping, including those relating to sexual harassment and violence and online sexual abuse. So that's very much probably a secondary perspective on it, but it then goes on to say that they will speak to leaders and other staff about how pupils at all ages are supported. And of course, when we're thinking about the road to sexual abuse, peer-on-peer sexual abuse and violence, that starts at a very early age. And it's about how, as governors, we know our schools tackle those inappropriate behaviours that, whilst they may have been acceptable and they may have been common practice when we were at school, things like, playing kiss chase, lifting girls' skirts up, tugging at bits of clothing, etc. All of those things. And Linda and I were doing a presentation a few weeks back now, and Linda made a comment that actually stuck with me. Best way of doing this is to think about, well, how would you like it now if somebody did that to you as an adult? And I think it's that mindset that we have to think about in terms of the support we give to our pupils, and also the way in which we teach our children about what's acceptable, about what isn't, so that hopefully when they grow up, they realise that relationships shouldn't be founded on abuse and violence. They should be founded on characteristics significantly more positive. And just on that one, inspectors are also told specifically in secondary schools to talk to pupils in single gender groups rather. They'll talk to pupils in all settings, of course, but not necessarily split up. But where possible, inspectors are asked to speak both formally and formally. And it says where they can, they will try to speak to some single-sex groups of secondary age pupils. So if you're a governor in a secondary school, that might be something worth sharing. Not all head teachers and pastoral care leads are aware of that. Linda's talked about online safety already. I'm not going to say much more about it other than it is sensible for safeguarding to be a recurring item on agendas for all governing body meetings, I would suggest, or if it's done in a committee, that's fine too. But make sure that your awareness as governors of safeguarding does extend to online safety. One of the things that we did in the last webinar for Governors for Schools was focus on the new edition of Keeping Children Safe in Education, which is the key guidance document on safeguarding in schools. One of the changes this year was to make it a direct responsibility of the designated safeguarding lead to have overview of the teaching of online safety. So again, we emphasised, I think, the importance of checking that out at the last webinar. Just a reminder there, that is important. Ofsted are asking questions about it, and they're asking governors questions about it. And we've talked a lot about pupil voice already. It remains a significant factor. Ofsted inspectors spend lots of time, both formally and informally, talking to children in our schools, and it is reported back on in the inspection outcome report. The first part of every report is, what is it like to be a pupil at this school? And that's, that is influenced in a very significant way by that feedback that actually comes from children and young people in our schools. And last but by no means least, what we've picked up from, as I say, in a lot of conversations we've had with colleagues, but certainly a lot of conversations we've had with chairs of governors and others who have been interviewed during inspections that have taken place since September this year. The first question isn't a new question, it's a perennial that Ofsted have been asking for many, many years. And even if you're a governor in a school that was judged to be outstanding at that, that far end of the spectrum, maybe 14 and a half or 15 years ago, how has your school improved since then? Now, if you are sitting in an outstanding school, sometimes that's a question you might have to ponder on a little bit to actually think about, what answers have I got there? And with all of these questions, I would suggest, as Linda said, we are not fans of the term preparing for Ofsted. We shouldn't prepare. But what we should ensure as governors is that whatever our responses to these questions are, they actually match the questions that our colleagues on leadership teams will be giving as well. So there is very much a theme of singing from the same hymn sheet here. So similarly, how has COVID impacted on your school? It's a very general question, and yes, we can talk about staff, the impact on staff. We can talk about perhaps if there's been bereavements in the school or other unfortunate consequences, but don't forget, Ofsted want to know about children's learning outcomes. They specifically want to know about the curriculum. So think about what we want to say. There has to be a narrative for all of these, but actually it has to be a considered and a thoughtful narrative that focuses on what Ofsted are expecting to hear from us, given our strategic overview as governors. I think we've said enough this morning already about it's the so what question. The so what question is always about what the response has been. So be able to have a few examples of, well, yes, we have had some gaps that opened up, particularly in children's reading during the pandemic, or as a consequence of that pandemic. And as a consequence of that, what we as a school have done is X, Y, and Z. And those are the sorts of anecdotes that are really quite powerful from a governance perspective and demonstrate that we do know our school's context, but more importantly, we know how our school has responded to its context, even though that may have changed during the pandemic. How does the school ensure that pupils learn about and are protected from the threat of peer-on-peer sexual abuse? That's a question almost verbatim that we know has been asked, certainly in 4 of the 7 outstanding schools that have actually been inspected that I know of. They are expecting governors to have a view on this. You know, we are not professionals. We are not the people who are the subject experts. That's not our role. But we are expected to know that this is a very serious safeguarding threat to children and young people at the moment, and therefore, as part of our strategic overview, we should know that staff have actually been trained. We should know that we've actually reflected on our policy, if we have one, for how we respond to allegations, how we respond to children and young people reporting incidents to us. And also, of course, it's about how we prepare children through that relationship, sex and health education curriculum for what the world ahead of them holds. And last but by no means least on this section, and again, I think it's important to recognise that there may be a political agenda behind this, but nonetheless, this is actually on the agenda at the moment. Ofsted invariably are asking in virtually every school at the moment questions of workload. What are you doing to reduce workload? What has been done in your school? So just as an example, I was actually in an infant school with a nursery and a reception class last night, doing some whole governing body training. And one of the intentions of the new early years framework is to reduce workload pressures, predominantly revolving around assessment processes. As it happened, the staff governor was the early years lead, and I specifically asked her, as a way of framing questions for governors, what difference has this made? And being able to quote the whole, actually our early years lead does say that less time is now being spent on assessment, which frees up more time to spend directly interacting with children, improving their language and communication skills. That's a great little anecdote to be able to tell. But again, if it hasn't been on the governing body agenda for a while, suggest it goes on there and ask your school leaders to give you an example. Ask them what they would say to Ofsted about an example of how we've actually tried to tackle the workload issue in schools. That brings me to the end of what I wanted to say and what Linda and I wanted to actually have make as input. I see we're just over the dot of 9 o'clock. So if there are any additional questions that, I don't know, are there any that we haven't answered, Linda, that we want to raise now?
I've been picking some up as we've gone along. There are just a couple of questions that might be worth addressing. Philip has asked about previous Section 8 inspections, which promised a Section 5. Particularly in those cases where they were expecting an outstanding judgment, hopefully at their next inspection. Mm-hmm. I don't know whether you want to make a comment about that. I think that will be quite a unique situation, but
yeah, there are 1 or 2 of those, and certainly it's more common in the other direction, of course, where there's been a Section 8 and they've actually then said it'll be a Section 5 next time. Those comments, whichever direction they come from, still stand, is my understanding from talking to somebody as an HMI very recently. So that doesn't change. But again, all schools are now liable, of course, to the up to 6-term delay on that.
And then there are a couple of questions, both from Gwen and Jan, asking about early years. We've got a new early years framework. How is that being inspected? Is it being inspected by an expert in that area? And my understanding is that the team will include somebody who will have enough information about how to look through that early years lens, unless it is only an early years provision standalone. Is that your understanding also, Steve?
Absolutely. I mean, you won't necessarily in a infant school or a primary school that's got early years have an early years expert, but all inspectors are trained to use the framework. And don't forget, it's a common framework. So they look at early years. Yes, it's got a different curriculum, but they look at it in exactly the same way as they would look at a Key Stage 1, Key Stage 2, or even a secondary school, or even a special school. All schools have, it's called a common inspection framework for a reason. But yeah, Ofsted inspectors have received training on the new framework, and yes, it would be nice to think that you'll always get somebody that has that specialist knowledge. But no, it's not something that happens on an ongoing basis, I'm afraid.
Bakul has asked about, I think it was when you were talking about staff wellbeing, do we need actual figures rather than anecdotal answers from staff to governors to see what changes have occurred?
I have never come across anybody demanding that. I think personally it's quite difficult to be able to quantify, we've improved, we've reduced workload by X%, we've improved work-life balance by Y%. I'm not sure how meaningful and relevant that is. I actually think being the ability to talk about tangible examples of steps the school has taken. The only thing that perhaps you might use to be able to back that up is the results of any staff survey that you've done. So, for example, the trust where I'm chair, we have had that moratorium on emails over weekends now for a year and a half. It's been reviewed twice, and we've actually got some very positive staff comments. So we've got some data, I guess, because we asked them on a scale to rank out how much difference it's made to them. But no, for me, I think those are the conversations about workload are best had individually, asking for people, well, it's the how was it for you question, really.
And I think that covers everything that was still open.
Perfect. Thanks, Linda. Well, thank you, everybody, for all those questions. If there are any that we've missed, we will go through all of the questions afterwards, and we'll actually get back to you individually by email. I mentioned the URLs at the end. You've got both of them there on the screen in front of you at the moment. And that just leaves us to say a very big thank you to you for joining us this morning. We hope you found the session useful. And we look forward to seeing you again in the near future at our next webinars. Thank you very much indeed. Enjoy the rest of your day and stay safe.
Thank you, everyone, and goodbye.
Thanks, everybody. Goodbye.